Tommy and Hugh gaped at Alice, feeling ashamed. They had panicked, while she had remained calm, thinking about what to do. Alice's two options swirled through their minds, and they desperately wanted to pick the one that gave them the best chance of survival. The problem was, they couldn't be sure which option that was, and they were also worried about looking like cowards. They knew their decision would determine whether they lived or died. When they managed to calm down a little, they realized that if they could hold on for a little longer until most of the monsters had been drawn to the center of the explosion, then they would have a much greater chance of escaping. If we don't get in the car and drive away, then it's only a matter of time until we're too exhausted to fight, Alice pointed out. Once that happens, we'll die. The second option is the best choice. You agree, don't you? No, they don't, a familiar voice called out. Alice turned around to look at Charles, feeling stunned at first, and then she smiled, glad to see him alive. A giant dog followed him, seemingly content to stay close. Tears of relief welled up in Alice's eyes. "You're back," she exclaimed. Although she had been trying to project an aura of calm, she had been fighting down panic. Whenever Charles wasn't around, she felt the pressure of keeping the team together until he could return. Charles gently wiped away her tears and said, "You did well. Now let's go back." Everyone felt the tension drain out of them at his reappearance. Even when they were surrounded by a large group of monsters, they could remain calm as long as they could see Charles was with them. After all, he was always the most dangerous person in the room, and that brought them much reassurance. "Get to the car," Charles said. "I'll lead the way." They all rushed to the car as fast as they could, piling in and starting the engine. With Charles with them, everything would be fine. They slowly drove out of the courtyard, and once they hit the road, they accelerated. They sped through the streets, their progress unimpeded. As they looked out the windows, they could see that everything around them had been burned to ashes by the hellfire. Faced with the evidence of the terrifying power of the Hellhound combined with Charles's sword, they were all shocked. The monsters that gave them nightmares couldn't even withstand a single blow from Charles. He simply mowed them down, not even breaking a sweat. Tommy and Hugh knew that strength was the foundation of everything. To keep anything, even their own lives, they had to be strong. After having witnessed Charles's ability to kill, they felt that sentiment even more keenly. If they had such strength, there would be nothing they couldn't do. Anyone who attempted to oppose them would die, giving them free rein. "Follow me." Charles took Alice's hand as the car drove through the streets, and she snuggled in closer to him. Then she lifted her head and kissed Charles's cheek, before lowering her gaze, feeling a little embarrassed. Charles looked around the car at everyone, wishing he could get rid of them all. If it hadn't been for having so many witnesses, he would have been eager to respond to Alice's provocation. Still, there would be plenty of time once they got back. With the speed they were traveling at, it wasn't long before they approached the city. Charles frowned and said, "Stop the car." Hugh stopped, and then they all got out of the vehicle at the inspection point. His relationship with the military had improved lately, so he didn't need to wait for an hour to be cleared, but the inspection still had to be carried out. He took the papers Tony Hughes had given him and showed them to the military officers patrolling outside the city gate. "I'm attached to the military now," he said, "so I want to know where those people are going to stay." He pointed to a group of people who were standing a short distance away. The soldier checked Charles's papers and then saluted. "Yes, sir." Charles scowled. When did I become an officer? He thought. It was a little annoying, but he needed the military to help him, so he tried not to let it get to him. Alice and the others noticed Charles's expression and looked in the direction he was pointing. "Aren't those people from his hometown?" Tommy asked, shocked. The people in question had gotten in Charles's way, so he wondered if Charles planned to take revenge on them. Alice tugged at Charles's sleeve and said, "Please tell me you don't still want to make things difficult for them." "My parents told me some of these people had families to protect," Charles said, his tone frosty, "so I will let those people go. But those who don't have family are useless, so why should I spare them?" Charles had already let them go once, not because he was soft-hearted, but because his parents had asked him to. After all, they were all from the same hometown, so Charles had given them advice, telling them to come here. His parents had told him that if these people died, then their families would have no one to look after them. But if any of them had abandoned their families to flee here, then Charles would not give them another chance. Without families depending on them, their lives were worthless. When the military saw Charles's murderous expression, they trembled. "Sir, no one is allowed to attack anyone else inside the fortress," one soldier bravely reminded him. Charles frowned. "There are some heartless thugs among these people," he said. "If they are allowed to enter the stronghold, then they will steal from others and even kill. I will not allow that to happen." He knew exactly what kind of people these were, and if given the chance, they would attempt to take revenge on Charles at the first opportunity. The guard looked at Charles and said, "If that really is the case, then I will ask the commander to supervise them." The guards quickly reported the matter to their superiors. Charles knew how the military operated, but he didn't care. Through his recent contact with the army, he had roughly understood their motivations. If he directly attacked any innocent people, the military would not forgive him. But if anyone planned to act against their army's rules, then Charles's actions would be regarded as self-defense. After entering the city, Charles's car was stopped by a group of people. The most eye-catching was a woman wearing a low-cut black dress. She was incredibly beautiful, making her the center of attention. "Haley," Alice said, staring at her. "What is she up to?" She knew she was just as pretty as Haley, but she wasn't as confident, or as shameless. If they stood together, Haley would get all the attention, purely because of her attitude. Haley had been trained by her family to make the most of her looks, even becoming a celebrity to increase her appeal. She was skilled at flirting, using her charm to get what she wanted, and she knew how to make men fall at her feet. Charles got out of the car, his eyes drawn to Haley. "Are you looking for me?" He didn't trust her, but she was extremely pleasant to look at. The members of the Summers family felt a little uncomfortable at the way he looked at her. Most people were at least a little more discreet when they admired her. But Haley wasn't upset. If Charles hadn't shown any signs of attraction, then it would have made her job much harder. She approached him, her movements graceful. Then she blinked up at him. "Can we speak in private, Mr. Federer?" she asked, laying on the charm. "I have a few things to discuss with you if you have the time." "Of course," Charles said without hesitation. Alice fought back a wave of anger. One flutter of Haley's eyelashes, and Charles had already forgotten Alice. Charles turned around and said to her, "Wait for me at home." Alice suppressed a shiver at the look in Charles's eyes. It was the exact same look he had given the people at the gate when he had wanted to kill them. "Okay," she said, "but please don't be long." Then she turned to Hank. "Let's go." Hank nodded, and then he drove them back home. Tommy couldn't resist teasing Alice. "Aren't you afraid Haley will steal Charles away from you?" Alice forced a shrug. "I love him, so I'm not going to worry about that." But deep inside, she was worried. At first, she had stuck with Charles because she relied on him to protect her, knowing that even if she became a paranormal, she wouldn't be able to survive this world without his help. But as time had passed, she had realized Charles was quite good to the people around him, and he often took risks to help the people he approved of. After Alice and the others had left, Charles followed Haley to the Summers family's residence, which was a 3-story villa. Outside the house was a group of overzealous fans, who began to scream when they spotted Haley's return. But when they saw Haley with a man, they began to wail. "The goddess is with someone! My heart is broken!" "Why is she with that man?" "Who is he? What does he have that I don't? Why didn't she turn to me?" Charles looked at them, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "I didn't expect you to have quite so many crazy fans." Haley smiled. "I gave them support and encouragement when they were lost," she said, "and I taught them how to survive. Now they're simply expressing their gratitude." Charles understood that when people were lost, that was the easiest time for others to win them to their cause. Anyone who could provide the reassurance they needed would have an army of followers willing to die for them. In the post-apocalyptic era, countless people were lost and hopeless. They were all desperate for guidance, willing to listen to anyone who could help. No matter what they were told, they would believe it, because they had no idea how to survive on their own. Haley led Charles inside and asked him to sit down. Then she introduced the 3 other members of her family to him. "This is my father, Max, and my uncle Howard," she said, gesturing to the 2 older men. "And this is my brother Tyler." They're all paranormals. I guess the universe really likes the Summers family. Charles smiled faintly. Yes, you're very lucky. Generally, only 1 out of every 1,000 people was a paranormal. So it really was rare for the one family to produce 3 of them at once. But in more recent times, that had begun to change. These days, if someone was a medicinal paranormal, then his immediate family members were also more likely to become paranormals. Some people suspected that this was due to their bloodlines and genes, which seemed quite likely. That meant that Haley would probably also become a paranormal eventually, if she ever got the chance. Max smiled at Charles. Yes, we have been exceptionally lucky so far. Of course, we cannot possibly compare to you in terms of foresight. I understand that you were able to create a tremendous force like the Dawn Alliance by yourself, and that's really impressive. No, I just felt it was better not to be alone, Charles said, adopting a humble tone. So I just intended to recruit a few more people to help me. But I expect to attract as many people as I did, and I haven't had a chance to check on them. Max narrowed his eyes. You don't seem to care much about this alliance. The alliance had only just been created, and already, Charles had walked out on them to go and fight monsters. Strength is the foundation of everything, Charles said, his expression serious. If I am strong enough, then none of my men will dare turn against me. And if I am not strong enough, then I've got to expect them to pledge their loyalty to me. Well said, Howard applauded him, nodding his approval. At first, I thought you would abandon the alliance because you didn't know how to manage things. But now I see that you are giving them a chance to prove their loyalty to you. I can tell that you're a sensible man who can see the nature of the world. In the future, strength will be respected. I apologize for underestimating you before. The Summers family knew how to charm people, but they sometimes overdid it and became annoying. But Charles smiled, enjoying Howard's praise. No wonder you managed to build such a foundation by yourself, Max said. You are indeed wise. But do you really have the confidence to control everything relying purely on your strength? Of course, Charles said confidently. Max frowned. But if any of your people have an ulterior motive, then even if you can use your strength to suppress them, you will still have lost some of your subordinates. He believed that prevention was more effective than having to deal with something after it had happened. Even if Charles could suppress any rebellion, he would gradually lose more and more of his people, weakening his position. That meant his original goal of establishing his forces would be difficult. Charles thought it over for a moment, and then he said, It doesn't matter. I can't have my cake and eat it. If I were to let myself worry about that, then I would give up on increasing my strength. Then I really would be too weak, and that would guarantee that my subordinates would overthrow me. Besides, even if the Dawn Alliance does crumble, I will rise to power again. He was confident in his ability to survive and keep his power. Besides, his goal in establishing a force had been to have people who would serve him. Although he had later realized there were other good reasons, the general intention had not changed. Max and Howard looked at each other, each surprised at what they were hearing. But nonetheless, everything was as they had expected. Charles was indeed dedicated to the pursuit of strength. And since that was the case, they would have common interests, which meant their plan should be at least partly successful. You have the means to cure energy deviation, Max said earnestly. That's a good way to win people's hearts. So it would be a pity if you wasted such an opportunity. If you were willing to use this ability to win people over, then you would have more people loyal to you. Charles shook his head. I've heard of generals who are good at war and are good at strategy, but I've never heard of one who can play nursemaid to people. Besides, the more people I treat, the more worthless the ability becomes. Healing was very useful, but it was valued mostly because of the scarcity of treatment. In fact, the true core of a team was always the most competitive person. If the healer became that core, it would be a disaster for the team. You're right, of course, Howard said. If you saved 10 people, those 10 people would be grateful to you. If you saved 100 people, then anyone who didn't receive treatment would grow jealous and begin to resent you. But I must admit, I didn't expect you to have such a thorough understanding of the human heart. Of course, Charles was the first person to establish such a large-scale alliance, so if he wasn't aware of such matters, they would have been suspicious of him. Instead, Charles had dispelled their doubts, and they were sure he knew what he was doing. "You said that you couldn't have your cake and eat it," Haley said, leaning forward. "But what if you could? What if I had a way you could have both?" Charles looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Oh?" he asked. "And I suppose you mean to help me take care of such matters within the Alliance?" Haley inched a little closer to him and smiled. "Naturally," she said. "I should have known you would guess what I meant." Charles knew Haley was trying to charm him, but he let her continue, wondering where she was going with this. "You saw my family's influence when you entered the gates," Max said. "It's easy for us to call up people who are loyal to us. If you want to join forces with us, then you could focus on improving your strength, and we will take care of winning people over to your side. Wouldn't that mean you could have your cake and eat it?" Charles looked at him. "Maybe, but I cannot increase the number of seats that belong to you in the Alliance." After all, the matter of who had power within the Alliance had already been agreed upon with Olivia and the others. If Charles changed things so soon, then the Alliance would quickly fall apart. So even if he wanted to give more power to the Summers family, he would have to wait until the Alliance was stable enough for him to do so. "As the leader of the Alliance, you are obviously its most important member," Max said. "Particularly with your ability to heal. It should be easy to recruit more people, and we only wish to help you manage your business." "Sounds good," Charles said. Then he looked at each of them. "But how can I trust all of you?" "There's nothing I can say right now," Max said. "But we will prove our sincerity with our actions, and there is much we would be able to give you." Charles smiled and asked, "For example?" Haley turned to her family and said, "Dad, Uncle Howard, why don't you let me speak to Mr. Federer by myself? I'm sure I can persuade him of our sincerity." Max stood up. "In that case, I'll leave it to you," he said. "Do what you can to persuade our guest." Then Max, Howard, and Tyler left the room. Haley stood up and walked over to the door, turning back to smile at Charles. "Mr. Federer," she said, "why don't you come to my room and we can talk there? If we stay here, we'll probably be disturbed." Charles shrugged and got to his feet. "Well, I wouldn't want us to get disturbed." Tyler frowned. "He still hasn't agreed to anything," he said, his tone anxious. "What if he takes advantage of our sister and still doesn't agree? What will we do then?" He wasn't particularly close to his sister, but he still didn't want the plan to fail in such a way. Max gave him a sly smile. "You underestimate your sister," he said. "I'm sure she will succeed, and then we can all get what we want." Tyler looked at his father. "Aren't you afraid that Charles will get angry when he realizes Haley has used him?" He wasn't sure exactly how strong Charles was, but he knew he was an important man in the city. If he gave the order, then the members of the Alliance would deal with the Summers family right away, no matter how they felt about it. And yet Max actually dared to toy with Charles, seemingly unconcerned about the consequences. Max patted his son's shoulder and said, "I just need a little more time to prepare, but don't worry. He has no idea what he's up against. When we take control of the Dawn Alliance, then we will ensure his relationship with Haley is real. If he doesn't cooperate, then we'll get rid of him." Tyler smiled. "I would expect nothing less, Father." "All right," Max said. "We need to stand guard and wait for the right time. Unless your sister calls for help, then don't go in." He paused. "By the way, what's going on with the Neal family?" They didn't have complete confidence in their plan to deal with Charles, so they made a lot of backup plans. Once they could truly control Charles's alliance, Haley's attempts to charm him would be for nothing. "They still think that after developing their cultivation method, there's something special," Tyler said. "They're arrogant, which makes them unable to see what's happening." Max snorted. "They're obsolete. If they can't adapt to the current times, then what use are they? Do they really think they can afford to make enemies with other people who cultivate?" As time passed, more and more people wanted to cultivate, which shifted the balance of power. The Neal family relied on outdated techniques, which had served them well in the past. But if they wanted to excel in these troubled times, then they would need to embrace change. Otherwise, they would be crushed. The lights were dim in Haley's room, and rose petals were scattered on the ground, leading to an enormous bed. A table was set with a candlelight dinner, and it was clear Haley had planned everything. Charles closed the door and looked at her, raising an eyebrow, wondering just how far she intended to take things. He stepped forward, running a finger down her arm, prepared to call her bluff and expecting her to back away. "So," he said, his voice low, "I believe you were going to explain why I should trust you." Haley smiled sweetly at him. "I thought we could enjoy a nice meal while we talk," she said. "Maybe we can even have some wine to relax." "Of course," Charles said, returning her smile. Haley was sure she had his attention, and she was certain her plan would work. Typical man, she thought. So what if he's powerful? In the end, he still fell for a beautiful woman paying him attention. But she had no intention of letting things go too far. She had another scheme in mind to get what she wanted at no cost to herself. She walked over to the table and poured some red wine into 2 glasses. Then she passed one of the glasses to Charles. Charles sniffed at it and took a tiny sip. "Nice," he said. Then he looked at the candles and gave her a wicked grin. "Just what exactly did you have in mind?" he teased. "I thought you wanted to talk." "I just like candles," she said, shrugging. "Don't you? I think they make the room nice and cozy. And they're scented, too." Of course," Charles said. "For a moment there, I was worried you might be trying to seduce me and take advantage of me. Wouldn't be the first time such a thing had happened." Haley flushed, unable to keep from wondering just how many times Charles had allowed someone to seduce him. He probably didn't have to make much effort, not with his good looks. Of course, if he was used to such things, then that might make it more difficult for her to get what she wanted. She was careful to keep her expression pleasant. She leaned a little closer and whispered, "Would that really be such a bad thing?" "Not really," Charles said, amused by her persistence. Haley lowered her gaze, feigning shyness. "You're such a tease," she said. "Why don't you go and freshen up, and then we can have dinner?" She showed Charles to the bathroom, and then she waited until she heard the sound of running water. Then she rushed over to a door and opened it, pulling another woman into the room. The woman was wearing the exact same dress as Haley, and her hairstyle was the same. Their resemblance was uncanny, and in the candlelight, it would be difficult to tell the difference between them. "Hurry up," she urged the woman, pointing to a couch. The woman nodded, and then she draped herself over the couch and picked up one of the wine glasses. Satisfied that her body double was in place, Haley sneaked into her walk-in closet. She didn't want to actually sleep with Charles, especially not until she knew she would get what she wanted from him. So instead, she had devised a brilliant plan. The red wine was laced with a drug that would confuse Charles's mind, making him easier to manipulate. Although paranormals had stronger resistance to this drug, she believed it should still be effective. Once Charles was under its influence, she thought she could get him to agree to anything. The drug should also ensure Charles didn't notice that the woman wasn't really Haley. Even someone with his strength wouldn't be able to fight off the drug's effects for some time. With any luck, Charles would sleep with Haley's substitute, really believing it was her. Then he would be committed to working with the Summers family without Haley having to get her own hands dirty. Proud of herself, she smiled. "Miss Summers, you seem very happy," Charles said, speaking right into her ear, his breath fanning across her cheek. Haley froze, and then she turned to look at Charles. "What are you doing inside here?" Her heart was pounding, almost as though it were trying to escape from her chest. Charles gave her a devilish smile. "Me?" he asked. "I was looking for you. After all, we can't have our little discussion if you're hiding in a closet all by yourself." Haley stared at Charles, terrified he had caught her out. But she had been a professional actress, so she managed to remain composed, determined to not let him see she was rattled. She smiled seductively and said, "That's funny. Of course I'm not hiding. I was just looking for something. I didn't expect you to follow me here." "How could I not?" Charles asked. "After all, you forgot your wine, and I was worried you might be thirsty. It would have been a shame if your throat was too dry to talk to me." Haley swallowed. She had no idea what to say. She was beginning to feel uneasy. Clearly her plan was going awry, and she wasn't sure how she could get out of this without admitting the truth. She had always been able to use her beauty to get what she wanted, but it seemed like Charles was much smarter than she had given him credit for. She wasn't going to get out of the situation very easily. If she wasn't careful, she might end up with a lot more than she had bargained for. A glass of red wine appeared in Charles's hand. "Here you go. Why don't you have a drink?" She stared at the glass, making no move to take it. "Is something wrong?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is there a problem with the wine?" "No," she said, sounding unconvincing, even to her own ears. She took the glass, but she still didn't take a drink. "I know it's drugged," Charles said, totally unconcerned. "And I saw your replacement sitting outside. Did you really think it would be that easy to fool me?" Haley couldn't stop her hand from trembling, and some of the wine spilled out of the glass. Charles took it from her and set it aside. Then he leaned into her personal space and said, "And did you really intend to throw that innocent woman at me, with no regard for her feelings? That's cold." Haley flushed, and she inched back a little, trying to put some space between them. This would have been so much easier if he had just taken the drugged wine like he was supposed to, she thought. But he hadn't, leaving her plan exposed and giving him the upper hand. What am I going to do? She wondered, her eyes darting around the closet. I've completely screwed this up. That's not, she said, trailing off. I mean, I didn't. She gaped helplessly, unable to think of a convincing excuse. Charles tutted. Then he straightened up and looked her in the eye. Haley glanced at the door, wondering if she could make it before he stopped her. She doubted it, and even if she could, she still had to try to salvage this situation. I'm sorry, she said, blinking up at him. I was just nervous, and I thought the wine would help us both relax, but then I changed my mind. I wasn't really going to have you drink it. I was just about to switch it for another glass. Charles raised an eyebrow. And you keep the other wine in your closet? He shook his head. You continue to believe I'm stupid. He leaned in closer and she flinched. Then he placed his hands on the wall, on either side of her head, caging her in. Now, you do seem to have control of a lot of people, Charles said, his voice low, and that could be useful to me. I'm not sure they'll listen to me, she admitted. They don't really take me seriously. They just want me to help them find a safe place, and they want to boast about being with a celebrity. If you gave an order for them to attack, then at least half of them would listen to you, Charles said. The other half would be afraid of Kevin's prestige, but they would listen, and I'm quite sure you have plenty of experience in getting people to do what you want. Haley couldn't stop trembling. Charles wasn't really threatening her, but he was exceptionally intimidating, especially when he was so close and speaking in that low voice. What exactly is your family up to? He asked, not breaking eye contact. A small whine escaped before she could stop it. Please don't ask me that, she pleaded. I'll be in trouble if I tell you. Charles realized that she was too scared of her family to talk, but it was important that he uncover their plans. So he shot an interrogation amulet at her, and then he asked, What is your family's plan? The interrogation amulet relaxed people's mental resistance, forcing them to give up information. It was an incredibly useful tool for interrogation. Haley muttered, They plan to gain control of the Dawn Alliance. Then they'll help the Neal family withstand the pressure from the military. After that, they'll kill Kevin. Since the amulet was clearly working, Charles asked her, Aren't you afraid that the military will cause trouble for you? Haley frowned. They're not afraid. There are a lot of us, so the military won't punish us. Charles felt a chill shoot down his spine. If the Summers family had the advantage of greater manpower, then they would directly challenge the military, and he didn't know what would happen then. Although he didn't wish to join the army, he still admired their efforts to maintain order during the apocalypse. After all, their plan was to establish a safe zone, which was a good thing. To expand their influence, the Summers family wouldn't hesitate to become enemies with the military. And no matter who won, it would make the situation even worse. Haley might not be aware of that, but Charles was sure her family was. The Summers family would probably take advantage of the chaos to become more powerful, uncaring of the carnage it would cause. Their plan was immensely short-sighted, and Charles couldn't believe they would do such a thing. It appeared that they had no long-term plans at all, and they simply didn't care about the future. I can't let that happen, he thought, even if I must destroy this entire family to prevent it. There was no way he would agree to work with them. It was bad enough that Haley had tried to make a fool of him, but their underhanded scheme was the final nail in the coffin. He forced down a flare of temper. Then he smiled at Haley and said, "Thanks for your cooperation. You've been most helpful." Charles backed away from Haley, finally giving her some space. Having gotten everything he needed, he left her in the closet and exited the room. He shook his head, amazed at the lengths Haley had gone to. On his way out of the villa, he ran into Max, who seemed surprised to see him. "I didn't expect to see you so soon," Max said. He had thought Haley would have kept him busy for much longer, so he was worried something might have gone wrong. Charles shrugged. "I'll admit that Haley went to a lot of effort to convince me of her sincerity," he said. "I'm sure we'll be able to come to some arrangement, but I have to be going." He paused. "Oh, and Haley seems to have an intruder in her room. Some strange woman. You should look into that." With that, he left. Max frowned. "A strange woman?" he muttered. "What on earth is going on? I'm sure our plan was working. We all saw him go into Haley's room." Concerned, he rushed to Haley's room and looked around, spotting Haley's body double. "Out," he ordered, pointing at the door. The woman jumped off the couch and ran from the room, unwilling to risk making him angry. What foolishness has my daughter been up to? He wondered, fighting to control his temper. Haley finally worked up the courage to open the closet door. She had heard her father's voice, and although she wasn't ready to face him, she knew she would have to do so eventually. There was no point dragging it out, so she stepped out of her walk-in closet, keeping her head down. "What happened?" Max demanded. She jumped, startled by the rough tone of his voice. He was clearly not happy with her, and she really didn't want to explain. Her family had been counting on her, and she had let them down. "He didn't fall for it," she admitted, biting her lip. "Of course he didn't," Max shouted. "You brought another woman here to take your place? The man isn't blind." Haley flushed. "If he'd just taken the drugged wine, he's not that stupid." Max took a deep breath, trying to rein in his temper. "I'm sorry, Dad," Haley said, blinking back tears. She couldn't believe how badly everything was going wrong. She had failed to get Charles on side, disappointing her family and incurring her father's wrath. The plan had been brilliant, and she couldn't understand what had happened. "Charles is our ticket to controlling the Dawn Alliance," Max reminded her. "He's the crux of the entire plan. You've really messed this up." She looked ashamed. "I thought I could handle it," she said. Max sighed, the rage draining from him. "We can still make this work," he said. "But please don't take matters into your own hands again. We can't afford any more missteps." Haley nodded, just glad he had stopped yelling at her. "There will be other opportunities for you to get close to him," Max assured her. "We can try this again." "Dad," Haley protested. "I hate him. He's made a fool of me, and I want him dealt with." "Foolish girl," Max snapped at her. "If we take revenge now, then it will only give the military an excuse to attack us. The Summers family might even be destroyed. But if we can somehow control Charles, then we'll gradually take control of the Alliance. Then we'll use our influence to become the controlling power in the fortress. Once Charles becomes expendable, then you can kill him if you want." Hatred flashed in Haley's eyes. "I definitely want to kill him," she said quickly. "I won't let him insult me like that." Max nodded in satisfaction. He knew his daughter could be spiteful, but he knew she wouldn't allow herself to be blinded by it. The more she hated Charles, the more determined she would be. "Then stick to the plan," he said. He looked at her. "Pull yourself together. We have work to do." Then he left the room, closing the door behind him. Haley sighed. She still wasn't happy with the way things had worked out, but she would do what was needed. After all, she had been raised to be of use to her family, so she knew her duty. Her revenge would have to wait, but at some point, she would make Charles pay for the way he had treated her. Suddenly her curtains fluttered, and the candles dimmed and then grew brighter. When she raised her hand, a gust of wind appeared, knocking everything over. She was shocked, but a moment later, she realized she had awakened. "This is great," she exclaimed. Now we'll see how much power I have in this world. She allowed herself a moment to express her rage. She threw things around and cursed loudly. Then, once she had regained control, she decided on a course of action. Her awakening had to remain a secret. But when she thought about Charles, a murderous expression appeared on her face. Charles returned to his residence, noticing the atmosphere was a little strange. "You're back," Alice said, her tone a little chilly. She refused to look at him, afraid of what she might see. After all, he had been gone for a while, and she hadn't been able to stop wondering what he was doing. Charles gently pulled her into his arms and said, "Yes, I am." "You stink," she complained, wrinkling her nose at the scent of Haley's perfume. It seemed her worst fears had been realized. A blue light flashed, and her water ability doused his entire body, washing away the offending smell. "Thanks," Charles said. "I had to get a bit too close to her when I was asking questions, and her perfume is ridiculously strong. I nearly passed out." She looked at him, desperately wanting to believe him. He held up a hand. "Nothing happened," he said. "I just interrogated her for answers." Alice nodded, deciding to believe him. "I know you wouldn't abandon me," she said. "Not for anything or anyone. When I'm in danger, I know you'll be there." She knew the world could never return to its original state. Whenever she went outside, she saw poor, starving people who relied solely on the compressed biscuits sent by the military to sustain themselves. Compared to those who had lost their lives, and even those who had turned into zombies, she and her group were fortunate. "Haley won't seduce me," Charles assured her, "but I'm going to string her family along for now." "Really?" Alice said in surprise. "Really," he promised. "You know what she's like," Alice warned him. No matter what Charles said, she knew Haley would do her best to get close to him, even if she was only planning to use him. "You know what they say," he said. "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer." But I won't waste my energy on her. I know what she's up to. Alice nodded. She didn't trust Haley, and she thought the woman was vicious. Who knew how far she would go to get what she wanted? She shook her head, trying to push the thought from her mind. After all, there was nothing she could do about it, and she needed to focus on her own survival. Charles said, "Also, there's a limit to a person's energy. I'm already at mine trying to guard against the people in the outside world. I don't have time for any of Haley's nonsense." Alice stepped into his embrace. "I understand," she said, sighing, "but I still don't like that woman." Charles smiled. Like Alice, he suspected Haley wasn't finished trying to manipulate him, but he wasn't worried about it. Whatever she attempted, he would be ready for it. Once he had finished speaking to Alice, Charles sought out Tina and Harper, asking for their reports. He didn't really care about the development of the Alliance. He just wanted to find the easiest way to retain his energy while reaping maximum returns. "We're useless," Harper said when she saw him. "We recruited 245 members within a day, but only 22 will help us on the front lines." It was a harsh blow to his leadership skills, and to anyone else, it would be a humiliating sign that he had been overthrown. Charles, however, didn't care at all. Instead, he smiled and said, "Look, it's only the first day of the large-scale recruitment. It still says something that 22 members want to pledge their loyalty." Tina and Harper felt a little bit better. Although Charles had taught them that strength was the best foundation, they were both still occasionally unable to maintain their composure. Charles thought to himself, "If they want to build up the Alliance, then I'll let them, and when they have problems with their recruitment techniques, they'll have to come to me." His confidence made Tina feel certain he had a plan. She knew that he wasn't someone who would let others walk over him. Even if power wasn't important to him, he wouldn't sacrifice what was his. "I'll let you both arrange the new recruits," he said. "Please don't disturb me unless it's important." He didn't ask for any details about the Alliance. "I'll give you the chance to increase your strength," he said. "But how much you can achieve will depend on your own efforts." Their eyes lit up at the prospect. If anyone else had said it, then they would have taken the promise with a grain of salt. But Charles's strength and resourcefulness gave them every reason to trust him. Charles wasn't interested in recruiting people one by one, and he had no intention of developing a personal relationship with every member of his army. He decided the better strategy was to control only the people he needed. namely Olivia and the other 6 primary members of the Alliance. He needed to find a suitable opportunity to let them know how important they were to him. If he could convince them, then it would cement their bond. The opportunity arrived sooner than he had expected. Soldiers needed a commander, and Charles only wanted to control the generals. After advising everyone to practice their martial arts techniques, he retreated to a room to examine the information he had retrieved from the bomb shelter. It was information that his enemy, Stellar Technology, wanted to obtain from hundreds of miles away. They were so desperate to get it that they had even deployed 3 armored vehicles. If he exposed them, as well as the fact that they had a large number of firearms, they would become the target of public criticism. Combined with his suspicions about the mechanical tiger, they could potentially face a significant amount of trouble. Although he didn't know how the tiger worked, he was still interested in Stellar Technology's biotechnology. Most significantly, their genetic enhancement pill. A martial artist's improvement speed was generally slow. Few people could achieve a level that was on par with the paranormals. Instead, they relied on numbers for survival. However, the creation of the genetic enhancement pill changed everything. It was made using zombie crystal cores, energy cores found in demonic beasts, and the corpses of the Crawlers clan. Through a series of extractions, these extremely concentrated energies were converted into ingredients capable of being absorbed by the human body, improving it at a genetic level. Of course, there was a certain amount of risk involved in the consumption of such a pill, but compared to the environment of the outside world and the harshness of their new reality, and compared to the shame of being unseated from the top of the food chain, the risks seemed insignificant. Stellar Technology was the first company to develop the drug. If Charles could find enough information in the research data he had stolen, then he could potentially become the leader of the era. But when he accessed the information, he suddenly realized he had made a huge mistake. I needed a damn translator, he thought bitterly. His foreign language skills weren't bad, and he could communicate with people from a vast range of countries, but he was nowhere near proficient enough to understand whatever advanced technical jargon was presented to him on the stolen pages. He needed a professional. When he considered how many experts he knew, he could only think of Zack, but no one knew where he and Miranda had gone. When he had parted ways with Miranda and the others, it had been with the hope they would meet again in Montreal, but he hadn't managed to find them. Moreover, he had been preoccupied with other matters and hadn't found the time to continue searching. He believed in his heart they were still alive. After all, Miranda and the other 3 were all early-stage medicinal paranormals. Also, they had all reached the tipping point of Tier 3 on their first day, so it was likely their strength had continued to improve. His chief concern was that their personalities clashed, and it was more likely they would kill each other than be killed by any zombie. He chuckled, and then he sighed. Maybe I'll see them again, he thought. He was about to put away the information when a hand suddenly reached over his shoulder and picked it up. What are you looking at? Susan Federer asked, examining the documents. Mom, he cried. What are you doing here? He noticed the plate of food in her other hand and understood. His mother had come to take care of him because he had missed a meal, too preoccupied with the research. He took the plate from her and ate gratefully. Good food was something that only those at the top could enjoy, and it tasted even better because his mother was a fantastic cook. Seeing her eyes still fixed on the papers, he asked, Can you read this? He looked at her. Do you understand this? There was a trace of panic in her eyes. Oh, it just looked like you were getting a headache, she said evasively. So I thought I'd take it away so you can eat and rest. He eyed her suspiciously. If you can read it, that would be very helpful. I think it's information that a lot of international biotech companies are fighting over. It might help us find an antidote for the zombie virus. Susan's eyes lit up. Really? Mom, are you hiding something? He asked slowly. I won't be upset if you are. Nothing surprises me anymore. Susan hesitated for a moment and then said, It's nothing really. I was a researcher for a small biological laboratory, but I gave it up a long time ago. It was too hard to conduct research when I had you to take care of. Looks like I've seen too many TV dramas, he said, laughing to himself. I'm starting to see things that aren't there. The genetic enhancement pill was not only difficult to develop and create, but the research also required a high level of expertise. Susan had been a laboratory assistant, and although she hadn't worked in the field for many years, she was extremely capable. When Charles asked her for help, she agreed to take a look. Charles's father, Doug, was also interested in the research, so the family of three began to discuss how to proceed. Charles looked at his mother expectantly. "Can we make these things?" he asked. She shook her head. "The data is detailed, but without any equipment, there's no way." Doug added, "This information ought to be shared freely throughout the entire country." Susan nodded in agreement, but Charles immediately rejected the idea. Not because he disliked his country, he would never betray it, but because it was against his nature to give anything away for free. Doug looked at his son sadly and said, "Think about it this way. You can't even read these papers, and they cost you nothing to obtain. So, give them to the country and forget about a reward. It's the right thing to do." Charles knew what his father said was true, but he could also exchange the documents for a favor from the military, and that could come in useful if he ever found himself in danger. Or at the very least, he could ask them to help him protect his family. Realizing he wasn't sold on the idea, Susan said, "We've seen the world outside too. You people with superpowers fight and kill all day. So many people have died with and without superpowers, but if we research this, we can still help them," Charles insisted. Doug sighed and picked up the documents from the table. "All right. We might not be big-name scientists, but we can do our best." He frowned. "Wait. Susan, take a look at this. Don't these look familiar?" As he spoke, he passed a document to Susan. She frowned. "It says they tried this part and failed," she said, reading the text. "Charlie, hand me that box." "The world has changed, Mom," Charles replied, handing it over to her. "Maybe things that failed in the past might be successful in this era." He paused. "Wait, have you seen this before?" Susan opened the box. "Doug, look at this," she exclaimed. "Does this remind you of—" She trailed off, and then she and Doug began to compare information, lost in their own little world. Charles was pleased his parents had proved so helpful. He didn't know how he would have felt about entrusting the work to strangers. As he watched Susan and Doug, he felt like he was seeing them both for the first time. Their family had run a medical clinic before the end of things. His father had managed it when he wasn't busy with their small farm. Since many people in their town couldn't afford medicine, his mother had often sold it at the cost price. They had never been rich, but they had always found money for essentials. It had made Charles frugal, and since his parents had damaged a few relationships by borrowing money, he had always been sure to avoid debt. After a while, Doug asked seriously, "Where did you get these?" Charles said, "Some foreigners driving armored vehicles were fighting for the information. I managed to get it while they were fighting a mechanical monster. They're all dead." He condensed the story significantly. It was best if they didn't worry about him, or how he provided food and other essentials. If his parents knew he had stolen the documents, then they would be worried about him. Doug sighed and said, "We have to tell him." At Charles's confusion, Doug and Susan told him about their past. "Your mother and I both went to university," his father said. "We wanted to ensure we both got jobs that would make some decent money. Then, when we graduated, we worked for a biological laboratory. We earned good money and made medicine. When your mother got pregnant, they were reluctant to give her maternity leave. They wanted to use you as a biological experiment, and we realized something was very wrong with them. We were worried they would do something to you, so we ran away. But before we did, we took something. Just some abandoned research." "I thought they would catch us," Susan confessed. "I didn't expect we'd get away with it. Later we found out that the moment we left, there was a fire in the laboratory. We never knew what happened after that, but we knew we had to stay hidden." "We realized we probably escaped at just the right time," Doug said. "If we hadn't, then you might not be here." "We felt so guilty," Susan said, "that we decided we'd make it up by doing good around our community." Charles was silent for a while after hearing the story. There seemed to be a karmic thread connecting everything in his life, and he realized that the company his parents had worked for was probably Stellar Technology. He knew Stellar Technology was just a facade, and the power behind it was unfathomable. He wondered whether his parents' swift exit from the company had coincided with the discovery of the laboratory. Perhaps the company hadn't thought the documents his parents had taken were important enough to track them down, or else they had been forgotten in the chaos. Rivertown had probably been one of the research sites, and when it had failed, the research had been abandoned. It wasn't until the apocalypse that the seemingly useless data had become a treasure. Now that he knew the data was linked to his parents' past, he decided to let them decide what to do with it. It was, after all, their discovery. Doug said, "When we were young, we were foolish. Now we can give something back to the country, and to humanity." He and Susan looked at each other and smiled. "Your mother and I have decided to join the Army's research lab and help them study," he said. "We want to make up for our mistakes." Charles nodded and said, "Okay." They seemed surprised that he had agreed so quickly, but Charles was thinking tactically. There were almost no safe places left. He had initially thought he could protect the people he loved, but when he had been reborn, he had realized things were far more dangerous than he had previously thought. His parents weren't paranormals. They were brilliant, but they were still ordinary humans. If they participated in the research, they would have access to the Montreal research base, and that was probably one of the safest places they could be. As cold-blooded as post-apocalyptic people could be, there were also good people around. Charles admired the general commander of the Canadian military. He was a great man who had fought for his country his whole life. Charles knew that, as long as he was in charge, Montreal would have peace. It was also due to him that Leonard was unable to expand his influence. And because of the general commander, Charles had survived for 10 years, despite Leonard's pursuit of him. Doug and Susan heaved a sigh of relief. Susan said, "I know it's not easy for you to hear all this information. It wasn't easy for us to give it to you." He looked at his mother and smiled. "Mom, Dad, you've taken care of me for 20 years, he said. "I can handle the truth. And you can go. It's what you want to do, and I'm happy for you. I can't let you take care of me forever." "Let's contact the military," Doug said. The outside world was dangerous. They knew their son was very capable, but no matter how old he was, they would always want to take care of him. But they also knew that researching with the military meant they could develop something that could help Charles. Charles contacted the military through his communicator and asked Lewis to come over. He wasn't very familiar with the military, but he had a good impression of Lewis, who acted decisively and took responsibility. Charles trusted him to take care of his parents. The military liaison replied, "Lewis is out on an important mission, so we'll send Tony to accompany them." "It is about a serum for the zombie virus," Charles clarified. "What did you just say?" the man asked, his voice trembling. "You said there's a serum? Are you sure?" "I don't know," Charles said, "but my parents have information that required me to kill a group of foreign gunmen and confiscate some weapons." He rattled off a list of the weapons he had seized. "I also seized 3 armored vehicles disguised as buses." When Charles finished speaking, there was silence on the other end. The weapons he had mentioned were all famous submachine guns and sniper rifles. The military knew what would have happened if a group of foreign nationals had appeared in the country with that kind of weaponry. "We'll cancel Lewis's mission immediately," the man announced. "Mr. Federer, please wait at home and protect the information at all costs."